Great. So it's great to see all of you here today on a frigid January day in Hanover. On behalf of the Nelson A. Rockefeller Center for Public Policy and Social Sciences and my colleagues Joanne Blay and Bob Coates, welcome to this year's Roger S. Aaron Lecture. The Aaron Lecture focuses on, quote, the study of the role of law and justice and ethics in public policy in the lives of individuals and society, all as part of the liberal arts curriculum of Dartmouth College. The lecture is endowed by the Dartmouth Lawyers Association under the Daniel Webster Fund, and it's been fortunate to host a range of luminaries over the years. These thinkers include the feminist philosopher Amiya Srinivasan of Oxford last year, and in prior years, speakers ranging from prison abolitionist Mariam Kaba to libertarian legal scholar Keith Whittington of Princeton, National Constitution Center CEO Jeffrey Rosen, and critical race theorist Kimberly Crenshaw of Columbia and UCLA. And I relay this history for two reasons. First, for our students, the history highlights the importance of engaging with and learning from a diverse set of serious and rigorous ideas. And second, turning to today, we're extraordinarily fortunate to have another such luminary with us today, Professor Jamila Michener of Cornell. Professor Michener is a leading scholar of public policy, health policy, racism, and poverty. She's Associate Professor of Government and Public Policy at Cornell, where she's also Associate Dean of the Brooks School of Public Policy, co-director of the Center for Health Equity, co-director of the Politics of Race, Immigration, Class, and Ethnicity Research Initiative, board chair, as I just learned, of the Cornell Prison Education Program. And her book, Fragmented Democracy, won the American Political Science Association's Virginia Gray Book Award, and she's a graduate of Princeton and the University of Chicago. Her talk today centers civil law and civil legal institutions and civil legal inequality in America. The talk today reminds us that we have to care about inequality not just in the criminal legal system, but also in the civil legal system. And this important project will help us refocus our attention on these essential issues, so we're very fortunate to be part of that conversation today. Please join me in welcoming Professor Michener to Dartmouth.
There we go. I confessed earlier that I find the introductions like very awkward because like usually when people are talking about you, you're not there, you know? And when you are there, it's like, oh, I don't know what to do with myself. And I certainly am not a luminary, but I appreciate the sentiment very much. I am super thrilled to be here today and really impressed with the room, honestly, because you don't know what you're gonna get in these kind of pandemic contexts. So I'm thrilled to have all of you here and also whoever is on live stream watching. And also just happy to be able to talk about this topic and share some of this work. So some of you I've gathered in classes that you have taken have read my work that's focused on health policy and Medicaid, and that really is my bread and butter, and I'll be, sometimes when I present this work, people say, are you now no longer doing Medicaid? And I'm like, no, I will always be, as long as there is a Medicaid. Maybe at some point we'll have like a better healthcare system that's universal and isn't multi-tiered in the way it is now. But so long as Medicaid is there, I will be studying it. But this is a topic that has long been near and dear to my heart and that I told myself I would sort of take up as my next big project. And so it's really exciting to be able to share some of my ideas with you all here tonight. I want to thank everyone who has helped to organize this. Joanne and Herschel and Bob have made this like easy and enjoyable. I've had a really great day. The students that I've met and all of the faculty that I've talked to, which this is clearly a very special place, and I hope you all feel that and recognize that, because I've certainly felt it today. So let's jump in, and as I go along, like keep your thinking caps on, because I'm excited to engage in Q&A once I get through this. So I'm gonna start with a picture for you, and that looks like it's just a picture of a Starbucks, but it isn't. Because it's not only the Starbucks. On the third floor of that building, above the Starbucks, and actually the Starbucks wasn't there until a few years ago, is a legal services organization called Queens Legal Services. And it's in Queens, New York, in New York City, which is actually where I grew up, not just in New York City, but I grew up in Queens. And I grew up in a neighborhood not very far from here. And it's a neighborhood that is predominantly Black and Latino, a neighborhood that has a high proportion of people who are immigrants and foreign born, and a neighborhood that is low income. And what Queens Legal Services does is they provide people with legal assistance in non-criminal and civil cases through this organization. And Queens Legal Services is funded through funds that come from the Legal Services Corporation, which is a federal entity that provides resources for legal services organizations all across the country to provide low-income people with legal assistance, and particularly with legal assistance in civil cases, in non-criminal cases. And so you're like, well, what are we talking about civil law for, and what do we even mean by that? So the reason this particular place is so important to me and so special to me is because I did an internship at Queens Legal Services the summer after my junior year in college. And I'm not going to say what year that was, because the year keeps getting further and further away every time I talk about it and making me feel older and older, but it was a while ago, okay? That Starbucks was like not good, was like a good 15 years out from being there. And I was super excited about the internship. I was thrilled that I had gotten it. It was an opportunity for me as a young college student. I thought I wanted to be a lawyer, but I knew that I cared a lot about and was passionate about racism and poverty. And so I wanted to try to connect those things. And I was also really passionate about doing work that connected me to the communities that I grew up in and the neighborhoods that I lived in. I didn't want to sort of go to college and forget essentially where I came from and the communities that in many ways I felt an obligation, a responsibility to. And so I was super thrilled to get this internship at Queens Legal Services, because I thought, this is what I want to do with my life. I want to be a lawyer, and I want to be a lawyer that serves people who are living in their poverty in the kinds of communities like the one I grew up in. And I was prepared to have an amazing experience. It was an intense experience, that's for sure. And I left this building pretty sad every day. The kinds of cases that were coming through were people who in many ways reminded me of my mother, my aunts, my cousins. They were low-income women of color, many of whom who were immigrants. And they were coming to Queens Legal Services because they were being evicted. Their homes were being foreclosed on. Their public benefits were being cut off. They were being deported. Their children were being taken from them by Child Protective Services, right? All of these things, they were being taken to court by their mortgage lender or their bank, right? All of these different areas, right, and that we think of as, or that I think of and we should all think of as sort of crucial to everyday life. Everyone needs a roof over their head. Everyone needs to have financial resources, and often many of us in contemporary society need to have access to credit. Many people, especially in low-income communities, need to have access to public benefits. Even something like an order of protection in the context of domestic violence, even though you would think violence, that's criminal. But getting the order of protection is a civil matter. And you need to have an attorney who can help you with that. And there are plenty of cases of women who were murdered by violent partners because they couldn't get access to an attorney to get an order of protection. So these range of things which really touch on so many aspects of people's daily lives, and not just people in a general sense, but people who are most vulnerable, often most marginalized, and least able to access legal resources, still have to navigate all of these issues, many of which are primarily legal, have facets that are legal, and it doesn't have anything to do with criminal activity or behavior. The civil legal system is not about the punitive face of the state that punishes you for violating some form of our social contract. Instead, the civil legal system is meant to be the protective face of the state that ensures that there is a neutral party who can arbitrate issues that can lead to exploitation or harm for people in their daily lives, right? And so The reason why the internship was depressing was because people were coming into this office with these problems every day. A big part of what I worked on was intake. It was a little bit like ethnographic research, although I wasn't a researcher and didn't think I would be at the time, so that's not the frame I had to it. But I had to sit there and ask people questions about why they were there, what their problem was, take notes. And then the lawyers would get those notes, and they would sit at a meeting every week and decide which cases to take. And because they are chronically underfunded, they could only take not even really half of the cases. And so there would be 100 meritorious cases, and they'd have to figure out how to cut at least 50, sometimes more of those. And it was a really, oh, I'm too loud. I often have that problem in life. It's not you, it's me. It was a really sad thing to watch. And the attorneys would sort of feel terrible doing it. And I, at the time, I was constantly asking why questions, like, why are so many people being evicted? Like, why don't you have better funding? Like, I would go to court with the attorneys and watch in court, and I'd be like, why did that seem so terrible? There has to be a better way. And I remember one day one of the attorneys saying to me, we don't do why here. We just do what? What can we do to help people so they have another 30 days before they get evicted, so that they can get that order of protection? Essentially, they were putting Band-Aids on bullet wounds. And that's absolutely important. If you have a bullet wound, you want somebody to do something, right? And so it was, I believe, God's work, absolutely. But it also became clear to me at this time that I couldn't do that because I was a why person. And it was never more like obvious to me that I wanted to think about like systems and processes upstream. And of course, it's not like that was like, oh, academia. There was like years in between of me figuring out my path to this particular place. But this was really pivotal for me, and it stuck with me. And when I got to graduate school, I would bring it up like, I want to study this, and people would be like, no, I'm a political scientist. Don't really do that. Nobody knows what that is. Nobody knows what you're talking about. But this experience made it very important to me. And so I thought, well, I'll start my career with something that's a little bit more legible to people. And then when I have the space to, and I have tenure and they can't fire me, I'm going to study this because the experience stuck with me that much that what is almost 20 years later at this point, and it still is sort of on the top of my mind. And even though all that time has passed, civil legal problems are still really common and really ubiquitous, especially in low-income communities, right? So about 3 of every 4 low-income people report experiencing at least one civil legal problem. This is in a survey that was taken in 2017, but we consistently see these same kinds of numbers in all manner of surveys over a long period of time. At least 1 in 4 low-income people who are surveyed say that they experience 6 or more civil legal problems. So there are a non-trivial subset of people who are living in or near poverty have these kinds of problems compounding, right? Importantly, and this is always a facet of inequality that I'm attentive to, the civil legal system, like the criminal legal system, although in different ways and through different mechanisms, is deeply racialized, right? So about 56% of people who receive civil legal resources from the Legal Services Corporation are people of color, right? And I'll add that on top of this, the system is also gendered. About 72% are women. So we're talking about a system that disproportionately affects low-income women of color. And so it's in many ways the flip side of the criminal legal system, which we think of as disproportionately affecting low-income men of color. And so there are important race and sort of class dimensions to this that mean if we want to think about inequality in legal systems and legal structures, we really have to think about civil legal systems and institutions. And of course, there is a problem, a deep problem of unequal access. So remember, if you don't, and know if you don't already know, that there is no right to legal representation in the civil legal system. So when you think like I get arrested, I get read my rights, that first line, you have a right to be silent, you have a right to an attorney. You don't have a right to an attorney in a civil legal case. If your home is being taken away, if your children are being taken away, if you are being deported, if your public benefits that you need to survive are being taken away, you are more than likely to face that alone in a court where the other side might have a lawyer, very likely will have a lawyer, but you won't, right? And so if we think about this from the kind of numbers perspectives, about 86% of low-income people with civil legal problems don't receive adequate legal attention for those problems, right? And so we're talking about a system that is limited access in a way that is grossly unequal, even though it's vital for the stuff of people's everyday lives. And the questions that I'm interested in as a political scientist are really questions that revolve around what the consequences of this are for our democracy, right? Because there are ways that the law could hold, especially civil law, which is supposed to be protective, which is supposed to be able to provide people with levers for having leverage in asymmetric power relationships, like the landlord-tenant relationship, right? Or the debtor-dettee relationship. You get to the court and that legal structure is supposed to at least provide you with some leverage in a kind of ideal theoretical sense. Everybody should be able to navigate that structure towards their ends, right? So there's a potential that individuals can mobilize the law. And this, we can think of this as like a crucial sort of democratic right? A crucial aspect of being a member of a democratic polity. And in mobilizing the law, that form of power and empowerment can translate into others, right? Now you have resources, now you have standing in the polity, and those kinds of things can have ripple effects. And so my thinking around this issue is really oriented around what are the implications for politics, power, and democracy when we have a civil legal system that is so deeply penetrating people's daily lives in ways that are profoundly unequal, very meaningful, and have repercussions for our democracy, right? So those are the kinds of questions that I ask and I think about in this larger project, which will be a book project. And I'm just going to talk through some ideas and some initial evidence today, but there's a ton more to it than I can cover. But I don't want to talk for like 90 minutes, right? I want to talk for less time so we can engage for more time. But so the questions that I've been asking myself as kind of the centerpiece of the book is, what is the relationship between civil legal institutions and democratic citizenship? Now, of course, the first question you should have for me when I say that is, what do I mean by civil legal institutions? And really, there are three crucial nodes that I think about here. One is maybe the first one that everybody thinks about, which is the courts. If you're being evicted, the first line of contact is that you're going to get an order that tells you have to show up at court at a certain day, at a certain time. And that is sort of an element of the system nearly everyone has to deal with for particular kinds of cases like evictions and foreclosures, because they are necessarily mitigated through the court system. Now, you don't have to show up at court, but if you don't, you'll be evicted, right? So either you show up and you have to interface with that structure, or you don't show up and your life is profoundly changed as a result. And so it's a necessary part of the process. But then there are also legal aid organizations like the building I showed you with the Legal Services Corporation. And they help to mitigate what happens when you're in that courtroom, what the outcomes are, how you navigate that space, right? So they're a second important institutional node. And then this third node is a node that was not a node as far as I knew when I first started this project. But as I've spoken to people, and I'll tell you a little bit about that, I've learned community organizations, grassroots local community organizations, are actually critical in helping people to navigate civil legal problems. Sometimes they connect people to legal aid, so they are the connective tissue between some of these different resources. Sometimes when both the courts and legal aid fail, community organizations mobilize people towards other kinds of solutions, policy solutions, or kind of grassroots like mutual aid kinds of solutions, right? Community organizations play a wide range of roles here, and they certainly shape the relationships between democratic citizenship and civil legal institutions, is what I've learned as I have done this research. And I'll show you a little evidence towards that end. Of course, I've explained what I mean by civil legal institutions, but what do I mean by democratic citizenship? And I'm really thinking about this in a way I think is quite basic, what I would call Marshallian perspective, which is there are at least 3 components, and this isn't exhaustive, but at least 3 key components of democratic citizenship, right? One is like the way we often think about democracy. We connect it with vote and the vote and voice and like political engagement and action. So voice and participation are like kind of a political component of citizenship. And I don't mean citizenship in terms of your legal status. Are you documented? Are you undocumented, right? I'm thinking about citizenship in a much broader terms than that. The second component is a social component of citizenship, which is about access to basic necessities. Do you have housing, a roof over your head? Do you have access to the kind of what we might think of as basic human rights that many people need in order to survive and thrive and navigate life? And the third part is a more civil part that's about, like I said, the kind of core purposes of what we'd imagine the civil legal system is for, protecting people from predation and securing whatever legal rights they have. Those rights on paper might be limited. That depends on what state you live in and on the nature of federal policy or what have you. But if you have them, we need a system to make sure that you can defend them, right? And that they can be enforced. And the civil legal system is supposed to play that role, right? And so part of what I'm trying to learn in this project are a set of things that I especially when I first started, but even continuing now, I'm always learning new aspects of this, that I don't even know I don't know, right? And this is how I think about the knowledge process in general. There's like, the stuff we know is like this much. And then there's some things we don't know, but we realize we don't know them, right? So then that gives us another little chunk of the pie. But most of the pie is this orange part. We don't even know what we don't know. And when I first started this project, it wasn't because like I had read a whole bunch of literature and I was like, oh, here are the important theoretical questions that emerge from the literature about civil legal systems. I sort of scoured for political scientists who were thinking about this, and there's some work out there relevant to different aspects of civil law. Union law, for example, is civil law, and so it's not to say no political scientist ever did anything relevant. But the particular facets of this that I was thinking about, there wasn't much. And what drew me to the problem was a problem-based motivation that I had seen this thing. I had sat there and watched people come into that office and heard their stories and left that legal services office every day for the summer of my junior year heartbroken that this is how people in my community where I grew up who look like me, who live like me, like my parents, like my family, like my friends, who were just facing profound deprivation in this arena. And that problem is what drew me to this. And when I started looking in somewhat the legal literature, certainly the political science literature, and across the social sciences, what I found was, I don't even know what we don't know. We don't know enough about this to know what we don't know. And once I realized that what I was really facing was trying to figure out what was in this orange, it was clear to me that I needed to take a qualitative approach. I needed to talk to people, because the beauty of talking to people is they can tell you things that you never thought about, that you would have never asked on a survey, that you would have never looked for in administrative data. When there are existing sources of data that you're either creating or mining, it depends on your pre-existing understandings of what the important things to look for are. But when you want to learn about something that you don't know about, well, you have to talk to people who do know about it. Maybe not from an academic standpoint, but from a personal, experiential standpoint. So I knew that's where I had to go with the project. If I want to understand some of the relationships, some of the connections, some of the processes linking democratic citizenship to civil legal institutions, I needed to get on the ground with people and understand their experiences, their perspectives, so I could figure out what I didn't know, right? And so what I've done over the last several years, and what I'm continuing to do, is really connect with key actors in this process. So far, I've done over 70 interviewers. And what do I mean? In-depth interviews. So I'm sitting down and talking to people for an hour for more, depending on who they are and how they're related to the system. Very open-ended conversations about their experiences. Very semi-structured. I go in with like 4 or 5 questions, but really I let people lead, right? And tell me things that I couldn't have thought to ask. And so who am I interviewing? Who are the key actors? Well, people who have legal problems, but they never sought out any legal assistance, so they've handled this on their own. People who did seek out legal assistance, they went to that legal aid office. They sat down and talked to the intake person, to me. It wasn't me, but they weren't among the group that the lawyers chose to represent, right? So they didn't get the legal assistance. Then there were people who did get that assistance. They did have attorneys in court with them. They did have representation. Now, these are the folks with the actual civil legal problems. I'm also talking to attorneys, the attorneys that represent civil legal beneficiaries, and members of grassroots organizations. So realize, I'm thinking about those 3 nodes of civil legal institutions: the courts that people experience, so I want to talk to the people who experience the courts and the lawyers, right, and the grassroots organizations, right? And so I want to get a range of actors that can give me a complementary and comprehensive sense of the system from their different vantage points. And then I want to observe what I can myself. So before the pandemic, I spent quite a bit of time observing courtrooms in New York, in Georgia, and in California, and different cities within each of those states. And then the pandemic happened, and I stopped for a while. And then we started having Zoom court. And then I was like, wow, this is actually easier, because I can observe courts all over the place as long as I can figure out what the Zoom link is, which is more difficult than you would think. And then I've done a ton of observation in community meetings of community organizations that have been in organizing meetings and such. The focus of all this work has been on housing. So I showed you that first slide, and I was like, here are all the different aspects of the civil legal realm. But you can't write a coherent book if you focus on all of those things. And beyond writing a book, you can't tell a coherent story. Each of those domains are so different. And so there's a benefit in focusing a bit so that you can understand one area deeply and learn what is possible from that. And then pan out and either have knowledge that you can apply to other places or that other people can take and apply to studying other domains. So why housing? In part because I've had a longstanding interest in housing, and it's just something I care a lot about. In part because as a scholar, my emphasis is on race, class, marginalized communities, and housing is like really a locus of a challenge and problems and a kind of driver of inequality for those communities. And then it's also a very common civil legal problem, right? So contract cases, which are essentially, many of them have to do with housing, landlord-tenant relationships, mortgages, and foreclosures, make up a lot of civil legal cases nationally. And when people report their civil legal problems, a lot of them are reporting that housing is one of the most common ones. And housing also obviously has implications that, that are racialized in a way that I think makes it quite important for us to pay attention to. So the focus of this project was housing pre-pandemic. So I've cared about this longer than eviction has sort of been the in vogue thing to talk and think about. But I think for all of us, the pandemic made us more aware of how crucial it is and how precarious many people are in their housing situations. But what many of us don't realize is that precarity gets mitigated through civil legal institutions. So if we want to understand how people navigate, deal with, and face precarity in the housing system and market, we also have to grapple with the legal institutions that the housing system often requires that they contend with. And so there are a few things that I focus on and that I'm going to go through some interview data around quickly and then wrap up, just to give you a sense of what I'm learning from people, what I've learned from people, and what I continue to learn, because I'm going to interview until I get to the point of saturation, and what that means is until I'm really not hearing new things. And that's hard, because you don't know when that will happen. I've done interview studies before where I get to 50 people and I feel like I'm at saturation. I've done research where I get to 20 people and I feel like, if I'm studying one specific policy and what happened to it, how it passed, right? I can interview 20 people and feel, everybody's telling me the same thing. I know what the story of this thing is. But this is a big project, right? So who knows when I'll get to saturation? So it's a work in progress, and I'll share with you a little of what I'm learning from people in their own voices. And The main takeaways are that civil legal institutions, people's experiences with them inform their political perceptions. And I don't mean like political attitudes like we would see on a survey. I mean the way they think about political actors in the legal system and who those actors are and how they're oriented to those actors. Civil legal institutions can motivate political action. This is really interesting. I didn't think this, going to the project, I thought this is going to depress people's political participation. These systems, they eat people up at their most vulnerable times and spit them back out weaker than they ate them up. And that was my sort of expectation going in. And I found that happens sometimes, but I've also found that there can be very different processes catalyzed than that. And that civil legal institutions play a role in building political power and capacity in race-class marginalized communities in ways that, frankly, I just really had not thought before this. I went into this project with very much a deficit story in mind, right? These are challenges for low-income people. These are profound inequalities. They face legal deprivation, and it's going to be politically disempowering, just like anything else, right, that is profoundly unequal. That's really what I went into this thinking, and it was talking to people that gave me a much more nuanced and complex story than that. Just some examples of each of these, and then I will be done. So these are a few examples. Candida talks about people in the state housing division. Candida is a woman that had faced eviction, and it was actually an illegal, unfair eviction. She lived in a rent control apartment in New York City. She was paying her rent. She had records and receipts of having paid her rent. The landlord had no standing to evict her, especially in a rent controlled apartment, but nonetheless did. And Candida thought she would go to court, show up, show them she had all the receipts, okay, all of them, and everything would be fine. And that is not what happened. She ended up engaged in a 4-year prolonged battle with her landlord. For a big chunk of that time, she didn't have representation. When she finally got it is when she finally was able to win the case and remain in. Rent control apartments in New York City are like gold mines. Like you better hold on to that. You will not have anywhere else you can go that's affordable and livable, right? So she fought tooth and nail for 4 years and dealt with a lot with people in the state housing division because she was looking for allies, for people to help and support her in the process. She says, these are a bunch of incompetent people. They don't know anything. They just don't get it, right? So again, perceptions of political actors. Ray, a man that I talked to, I met him in a courtroom in Fulton County in Atlanta. I sat there and watched his case unfold, and it was just the saddest thing. And it's too long of a story to tell you. There were just a lot there. And I left after the case ended, and I caught him in the hallway, and I said, you want to talk about what just happened? And he said, yes. You think you catch people at their worst moment that they're like, leave me alone. Actually, they're like, oh, dear God, somebody saw that. I can talk to somebody about this. And he says, the government, they want us, and he's talking to me, he's talking about black people because he had referenced that earlier in the conversation. They want us homeless. They want us on the street. They want us desolate. And after I watched his trial, that is precisely the conclusion I would have drawn too, right? And so he's leaving there thinking in very particular ways about the government. Sora, who had been evicted on 3 separate occasions, each time legal aid successfully defended her because none of the evictions were legal. And if she hadn't had legal aid, she would have been evicted 3 times over. So even though it didn't end in the worst way for her, she still walked away with a sense of judges as racist and was able to give me specific examples. She even had, Sora was biracial. Her mother was Korean and her father was black. And she said she walked into court and a judge said, what are you? Asking her about her racial identification. And she said, they have to figure out what category to put you in because that's how they figure out how to treat you, right? And then a woman named Alicia, who I talked to in Georgia, and she talks about, she had a larger kind of political economy story that had been generated from years of experience with eviction. When I talked to her, she was in her 40s. The first eviction she experienced was at 9 years old. And she talks about how throughout the life course, at every stage of her life course, she has an eviction memory, right? And why? And she's moving from neighborhood to neighborhood to neighborhood. and then it gentrifies and they want you out. And then you move and to a worse place, and then it gentrifies and they want you out. And you move, and you're running away from the gentrifiers, and you're constantly getting evicted. And look, housing policy, what is this about? Used to racialize generations. She has a much broader way of thinking about it in my own personal history. And she didn't realize it until she was an adult. And she says it's used for other people's capital gains and our losses. And she talks to me about bankers and corporate landlords and property management companies, all of these actors in the political system, the political game, as Alicia called it, who she developed really nuanced and sophisticated takes on. And Alicia hadn't been to college, but she could tell you all about the political economy of Atlanta, right? And where did she get that knowledge? Well, from her experience with being evicted again and again and again, and her experience with the actors that she encountered along the way in courts through legal aid organizations. And she was politicized and developed this like larger understanding and kind of political economy framework by engaging a grassroots organization. So when I interviewed her, the time I interviewed her, she was a leader of that organization, right? But she started as someone who was getting evicted, who they helped work through the process. I'll give you an example of political action being motivated. This is a man named Ronald. It's a lot of text, so I highlight the key parts in red. You don't have to read the whole thing. But Ronald had his lungs collapse, and when he got out of the hospital, the day after he got out of the hospital, his landlord's lawyer served him. He had no idea. He had been in the hospital for 2 months. He had still been paying his rent, even while in the hospital. He had never paid rent a day late. Why would he be getting evicted? He stood there. He was a single parent. He is a single parent with 5 kids, and his landlord's lawyer knocked on the door. He said, I wasn't even supposed to be getting out of bed. I was still on bed rest. He dragged himself out of bed and opened the door only to be served. And he just couldn't understand why. He said at one point, I couldn't understand. They gave him the papers. I couldn't understand one document, one paragraph, one sentence of what I was reading. Ronald didn't graduate from high school. All he knew was I was paying my rent. Why would this be happening? And it turned out it was an illegal eviction, and he ended up getting the defense he needed. But along the way, he got help not from legal aid folks, yes, but he got connected to the legal aid folks through a grassroots organization. And that grassroots organization told him, you're not the only one. This is happening to a lot of people. We can help you with your case. We can connect you to people to help you with your case, but this is bigger than you. And so Ronald realized at one point that what he went through was so terrible. And at some point he says to himself, I want to make sure tenants have lawyers. This is the fight, something that I want to participate in, because no family should ever have to go through what I went through for no reason. And Ronald ends up being one of the leaders of the movement, the right to counsel movement in New York City, to get people in housing court legal representation if they're at 200% of the poverty line or below. And this is not his real name, but if you Google right to counsel New York City and you look at pictures of you'll see people in these orange shirts with an organization and holding up signs at protests, talking to the mayor. 4 years they did this for. And I wouldn't tell you which one it was, but one of the people you'll see in many of those pictures is the person I'm calling Ronald here. He was at the forefront. Ronald is a single dad, 5 children, black man, low income, didn't graduate high school. And he led a movement that was successful. They pushed the mayor of New York City, who at the beginning said, no, we're not giving right to counsel, it's too expensive. And 4 years later, they got their right to counsel. And then the mayor said, no, we're not giving it to people in public housing. That doesn't make sense. We're the landlord. We're not going to fund people to fight us. Guess what? People in public housing. They did not relent. And Ronald was at the forefront of it. And why? His experience with the process itself was a catalyst for political action. And there are many more examples of this, right? Examples of organizations that say, you know what? We thought we were only going to get 30 people there. We got 300 people there. We did so many direct actions and people came out, right? Why? Because people were hurting. People were struggling and they were like, oh my gosh, this could help me with my problem. You go to the ballot box and you vote, what comes of that? But if you can push your local elected officials to give you a right to counsel or to improve access to rental assistance, that can change your life, right? And people use tactics like eviction blockades. An eviction blockade is, look, somebody's getting evicted. Everybody from the organization goes to their house and surrounds it at the exact time the sheriff is supposed to be there. Because if there are 50 people in front of that house holding hands or chained to the building, guess what? The sheriff has to leave. They can't arrest all of them, and they can't start a violent infraction in order to enforce an eviction. And then guess what? Every time the sheriff shows up, you do that. And there are people who have done, I spoke to a woman who did, this organization did eviction blockades for her for 3 years. And the landlord gave up. Look, you can just stay here. Pay the rent, and I'm done trying to get you out, right? And she was paying the rent, actually. The landlord just wanted more rent, and the neighborhood was gentrifying. And said, if I get you out, I could get somebody in here who could pay twice as much as you. She said, but I've been paying my rent every month. Doesn't matter. I want you out. And the organization that she was with said, no, you're not getting her out. You're not. And they just wore him thin, right? This is the kind of engagement that people have to be able to put their bodies on the line. These are people who are already so marginal, living such difficult lives, but they do it. And so these kinds of legal problems can catalyze political action, absolutely, and they can help organizations to build political capacity. This is an organization in New York City that was also at the forefront of the right to counsel movement. And they realized at some point, the court is really the root of the problem. So if we want to address this problem, we have to build tenant power. People are leaving the courtroom disempowered, but we have to turn that around, right? So they start with a participatory action research project. They help tenants to get more information about the state of affairs in the neighborhood. Tenants are going door to door, surveying their neighbors, telling them about the organization. They used even finding out about the legal problems in the neighborhood as a base building tool. And then eventually this organization spearheads a major movement in New York City to expand a right to counsel, right? And there are all sorts of ways that organizations build political capacity through civil legal institutions. Many of them do court watch and court assistance. They show up at the court, they find people who are being evicted, and they say, just like I followed Ray out and I said, hey, you want to talk to me? They follow him out and say, hey, we can help you. First of all, do you need rental assistance? First, they focus on helping people with the material needs. But then they work them. Tell us your story. Connect with us. They find an in so that they can bring people into the organizing apparatus and they can build their power. And that was a story that a lot of organizations told, right? And organizations get creative in terms of what they do, right? This organization said, you know what? We're just going to go to court and take records. We're going to take notes. We can't get them to respond to our public records requests. Nobody knows what's happening inside of there. It's a nightmare that's totally in the dark. We're going to bring it to the light. We're going to publish it on our website. We're going to make sure the press knows. And that really built their organizational capacity. As people started to find out what was happening in those courts, people would come to their tenant organization and say, can I be a part of their, when they started collecting this data, they saw their organization grow and grow. And they had the sense that the local narrative was changing, right? So the courtroom itself can be a physical opportunity to lay the groundwork for mobilizing people politically, right? So these are a few, I wanted to give you concrete examples of what the possibilities are in terms of civil legal institutions and democratic citizenship. And of course, along with possibilities are also perils. And we could be here all night if I showed you slides of people telling me how demoralizing their experiences with this system were, right? And one of the interesting things that I found, and I'm rounding out here, this is my last substantive slide, is that for each of the nodes that I talked about earlier, courts, legal aid, community organizations, they're playing a different role here. People tell me about their experiences in court, and they find it alienating, confusing, demoralizing. But court systems themselves are powerful. They really can have a profound effect on people's lives. But the people within those systems who are being affected feel powerless and alienated, right? Legal aid is actually different. People like Ronald who get assistance from legal aid, who realize how valuable that is, are sometimes motivated to help, to make sure other people can get that assistance, to participate in ways that make that possible for others. But the mobilizing capacity of legal aid is limited because that's not their job. Remember what the attorney tells me, we don't do why, we do what, What can we do? How can we put a Band-Aid on this bullet wound? Not, where did the bullet wound come from? How can we change the systems? That's not what legal aid does. So sometimes it happens incidentally. But if someone like Ronald doesn't find a community organization to catalyze and channel that, it often doesn't happen. But legal aid is, they at least have resources, right? They're not as powerful as courts that make critical decisions, but they can mitigate how those critical decisions are made. They have expertise, they have standing in the legal realm, and they have some resources from federal and state and local governments. Community organizations are probably least powerful in the scope of these nodes. They don't have great funding streams. They don't have any particular standing in courts or before the law. They're not even considered, these aren't even legal advocacy organizations. They're just regular old grassroots organizations. And they have very little resources, very few resources. But they are directly mobilizing communities. And they're using legal problems as power-building opportunities in an explicit and intentional way. But the organizations themselves are resource-deprived, and their reach is limited, right? They usually serve particular neighborhoods, sometimes particular cities. And so the more powerful an organization is in terms of how it can affect people's lives, its reach, its resources, or not an organization, but an institution, the worse it's doing in terms of how it affects people's experiences. And then when you get down to the least powerful institutional node, which is community organizations, at least in terms of resources and reach, they're actually doing the work of using these civil legal problems to build power. And I say this just to underscore, there are certainly possibilities, and there are aspects of this research that I got really excited about, because I was like, wow, you can take this profoundly unequal system and use it as a springboard to build power in the communities that most need it and least have it. But the flip side of this, just to balance the possibilities with the realistic perspective of the perils, right? That the folks who are doing that, who are trying to build the power, are least resourced, least supportive, and not embedded in a way institutionally that gives them a wide reach. So there are some real challenges here. And of course, policy contexts matter. This is different in New York than it is in Georgia, than it is in California, which is why I've done my research across states. There's a whole nother talk I give about that state variation and how it matters. So I won't say any more about that now, except to say this is a complex, nuanced, multifaceted process. But it's one that is profoundly important for people's lives, one we should all be aware of and certainly be thinking about, and one that I hope we can see transformative change in the years to come. So I will end there. Thank you for your time and for listening, and hopefully we have some time for conversation. I don't know how long I've been talking. I should have timed myself. Okay, I'll end on that. Should I unmute you as well? That way we can both. Yep, I'm unmuting you. Yeah, I just did it.
Grab some water.
All right.
Great, so I will ask a quick question or two, and then we'll just turn it over to the audience. For people online, please feel free to email your questions to rockyqa@dartmouth.edu, including the student who earlier I promised if you emailed your question, we would ask it. So,
There you go. Promises made have to be kept.
Yes, but I'll start off and then we'll throw it over to you, which is, I'm just wondering why you think that institutional funders and scholars have overlooked these organizations. So on the institutional funders front, it strikes me that the results of your work might correct a perception they have that these organizations are disconnected from broader politics and might help them, like the Mellon Foundation put resources into this. On the scholarship front, though, it's always puzzled me. So Dartmouth's Lynn Mather is one of the few political scientists to ever to sort of look into these. But when I teach about this, I assign sociologists and anthropologists instead, even though, as you've said, these organizations engage in core activities of mobilization, participation, collective action, preference aggregation, data collection. And so I guess just on both fronts, why have these been overlooked, and what enabled you to not fall prey to that?
Yeah, I mean, I guess in the first instance, I want to be fair and say there are certainly folks who have been paying attention to this kind of thing, right? It's not salient, certainly not in terms of the academic scholarly community, and also not in terms of funders. But so I want to both credit those folks that have like long been out there saying like, hey, what about civil legal systems? And acknowledge like that many of them were like lone voices who weren't, and the kind of attention that the criminal legal system gets, like there's just no comparison between that and the civil legal system. Although, you know, most people will never have an interaction with the criminal legal system, depending, that varies a lot by race and gender. But many people will never have an interaction with the criminal legal system or never even have a problem that necessitates that. Whereas a lot of people will, at the very least, have a problem that could lend itself to engaging the civil legal system. And many people at some point in some way will actually engage with that system. So when we consider the scope and the nature of the problems at play, it's like, why has the civil legal system been like the friendless stepchild, you know, in the same way that people used to call Medicaid the friendless stepchild of Medicare? I guess I'm drawn to friendless stepchildren. So any friendless stepchildren in the room, I'm your person. But I think a couple of different reasons. One is really like many of the people for whom this system is most pivotal are the very people who are invisible to us in society more generally, right? They're the sorts of people who are like emptying the trash in your office building and keeping like society running through low wage and other kinds of labor in the background, but not the folks we pay attention to. And we don't have like law and order, SVU. Like we don't have like cultural symbols that are drawing us to pay attention to this system. The system is essentially mostly dealing with people who we tend to ignore and undervalue in systematic and consistent ways. So it's not at all surprising that it's one that both funders, academics, and ordinary people, the number of people when they ask me, oh, what's your next project about? And I say, oh, the civil legal system. And they're like, what's that? I mean, these are scholars who ask me this, but also like regular people. And it's like no one has any idea. Or when I say, you know, you don't have a right to representation in civil courts. And they're like, no, but that's in the Constitution. It's like, no, it's not. Nor is it constitutional precedent or legal precedent. So I think that you're right. There's a lot of space for growth in terms of people becoming aware of these issues. And you're especially right when you say by connecting the political angle, it like makes it that much more clear how critical the issue is, because this isn't just about what will it be like for this woman when she goes to housing court, although I think that matters a lot. But it's like that there are millions of her and that they're all members of our political community. And what does it mean to have a democracy where none of her can go into that courtroom and expect to find something that approximates justice, right? It means that that's a deeply flawed democracy. And what does it mean that it's possible for someone like her to be catalyzed towards political action and to think about how to use these systems as a mechanism to do that? Well, that would be a really promising for democracy potentially. But unless we're thinking about studying, understanding, and investing in these systems, we're never going to know.
Why don't we take 2 audience questions at a time? We'll start with students, as we always do.
I love that preference.
Which means we will sit here until 2 students raise their hands.
There's no pressure at all, except there is.
Yeah, Ethan, start us off.
So I was really surprised to hear that experiences with the civil legal system were motivating people to get involved in politics, because in your other work, in your book, you talked about how much Medicaid was demoralizing people,
Yeah.
making them feel disempowered. So I was wondering if you had any ideas on like what the major differences between these two systems are that might be motivating people in one and disempowering them in the other.
Ethan, were you in the other class sitting next to Jason and Jasper? And I remember because I felt like I really wanted to get a chance to call on you, but all of you had so many amazing questions, and I blabbed on for so long that I couldn't get to you. So this is lovely, Ethan. Like, my guilt is assuaged. You got to ask a question, and it was the perfect question. So thank you for being that brave soul to start us off. That's a good question. So a key element, in my view, that differentiates, there are so many differences, but a key element that differentiates the kind of political landscape and possibilities in the civil legal system versus with Medicaid is this role of community organizations, right? So community organizations are a connective tissue and a catalyst that take people from understanding their civil legal problem as an individual problem, like I have a bad landlord, or my landlord is trying to rip me off, or, that is a single dyadic relationship. It's me and my landlord. And if that's all you ever think of it as, you go in the court and you try to mitigate it through that lens. But a community organization comes in and says, you know what? It really isn't about you and your landlord. There's a system. And that system disempowers you, it disadvantages you, and it empowers and advantages your landlord. And that system is class-based, and that system is racialized, and that system isn't right. But if you get together with other people like you to fight against other landlords like your landlords, guess what? We can actually change the system for everyone. And without organizations creating that narrative for you and helping you to understand this is actually part of a bigger problem, and channeling your political energy so that you can know how to try to solve that problem, that doesn't just happen naturally per se. And so I think with Medicaid, in the case of Medicaid, a lot of the key organizations that do political work around Medicaid, they are advocacy organizations, meaning they advocate for Medicaid beneficiaries. And maybe they pluck up some beneficiaries and bring them to the legislature with them so that somebody can hear a voice. But they're not let's build power among Medicaid beneficiaries. They're, let's advocate on behalf of Medicaid beneficiaries. A lot of the organizations I've encountered that are tenant and housing-based organizations that help people deal with their civil legal problems, they're membership-based community organizations. They find out people have civil legal problems. How? Because they're engaging those people in those communities. And then they try to help turn those problems into power-building opportunities. And so the organizational landscape of Medicaid and civil legal institutions is very different. And it's different in a way that means that one lends itself more to actually being a catalyst for political engagement, and the other not as much, although of course we know in the case of Medicaid that really varies based on state and geographic location. So hopefully I think that is the key difference. It's not the only difference, but it is the key difference. I feel like I want to call on people, but nope, no, you do the calling.
Anthony, go ahead.
Hi, Professor. During the talk, you discussed some of your approach to interviewing political actors within various institutions. I'm wondering if you could expand a little bit on your approach, particularly on how you gauge your saturation with the topic, and especially when you're engaging with so many different aspects of these civil legal institutions.
That's a great question, Anthony. Anthony, you can't get enough of me. Anthony was at lunch today. I felt like, if I were you, I would not have come to this talk. A speaker gets one thing from me. I'm at the talk, I'm at the dinner, there's only one of those things I'm gonna do. But you are better than me. And that wasn't a high bar, but you have well exceeded it. No, I think this is a great question. Saturation is hard, right? And a lot of people, it'd be easier for me just to say, I'm gonna interview 100 people. And 100 sounds like a lot. You interview 100 people, you have thousands of pages of transcripts, right? And that's hours and hours of work. You can get so much from 100 interviews. I've done 70, I think I'm at 73, and I already have so much, right? I stop every batch and no, I gotta do some processing. I can't keep going. So it would be easier for me to just pick an arbitrary number that sounds high at least to qualitative researchers. Quant people are you only talk to 100 people, it doesn't mean anything. And you're oh my gosh. You know how much I learned from 100 people who have deep lived experience. But the reason why I can't just pick an arbitrary number and why saturation is important is because I want to understand that, you remember the pie chart, the orange, what I don't know, I don't know. I want to make sure I've gotten the full range of that, right? And it's hard to know when you get the full range. And saturation is the closest approximation to that. And so, really, you said, well, how do you get to saturation when you're talking to so many different kinds of people? You're talking to lawyers, you're talking to people with a range of relationships to the civil legal system. Well, that's exactly it. It takes longer to start hearing the same things over and over again when you're talking to so many different kinds of people, right? But once you do start hearing the same things and consistently hearing the same things, given the heterogeneity of the actors, that's a solid signal that you have reached saturation, Somebody asked me recently, what if you don't get to saturation? Like, you can't keep doing interviews forever. Like, what if you were gonna reach saturation at 1,000 interviews? Like, you cannot do 1,000 in-depth interviews, right? Or, I mean, you can if you have, like, I don't know, a multi-million-dollar grant. I cannot do 1,000 in-depth interviews, right? So saturation can be hard. And I can decide I wanna saturate within group. Like, I'm talking to lawyers. Once I start hearing the lawyers say the same things, I stop interviewing lawyers. I'm talking to, civil legal aid beneficiaries. Once I start hearing them saying the same things over and over again, I stop talking to them. So if I do that, I'll get to saturation quicker. But if I'm looking for saturation across groups, like I want to wait until the lawyers are saying things that like are complementary or resonant in some ways with what the civil legal aid beneficiaries are saying. That's a higher bar for saturation, right? And so it depends on how you approach saturation and what you're looking for. And I can adapt and adjust so that so it's reasonable, so I don't have to do 1,000 interviews. But I've never gotten to the point where I felt like I wasn't going to reach saturation. And like I've said, I mean, sometimes it's taken only 20 interviews, and I'm like, oh, I pretty much know the story here. And other times it's taken many, many more than that. I'm in the middle of a study that's focused on Medicaid right now, and I don't know, we've done well over 200 interviews. And I don't think we're at saturation. It doesn't even feel like we are, right? That's a big project, and we anticipated doing, 300 or 400 interviews. So it's okay that we're not at saturation yet. If we get to the 400 and we're not there, like that will be a different problem. But I've never experienced that problem, and don't you jinx me. Great question.
Yeah, Ron.
Thanks, Jamila. This is great. Two things come to mind. Is any proportion of this kind of interaction bumping up against street-level bureaucracy, is HUD or Social Security Administration, where they're sort of administrative law activities rather than judicial branch activities?
Absolutely. I love that question. So like Ronald, who I told you about in the presentation. So 2 days after he comes back from spending 2 months in the hospital with a collapsed lung, his landlord's lawyer shows up and serves him. Well, Ronald had been paying his rent, remember I told you, but he was on Section 8, so the housing voucher program. What that meant is he had a small portion that he was responsible for paying every month, given his very low income and also being a single father with 5 children. That was something like $200 a month. The rent for the apartment was like $1,300 a month. So the government, through the Section 8 voucher program, is paying the other chunk, right? And the landlord has to do particular things in order to keep getting that money. They have to show, for example, that the housing is not substandard. Well, Ronald's housing was actually substandard. And HUD had him fill out a form, checking off certain boxes about the nature of his housing. They realized your landlord's not doing what he's supposed to be doing. Like, you have mold, you have a leak in your ceiling, you have all these unhealthy things. We're not going to pay your landlord until they fix this. So HUD stopped paying. Instead of fixing it, the landlord said, fine, you can go. And that is why Ronald was getting evicted. It took him a while to figure that out. That's why he needed legal assistance, because he was like, but I'm paying, this makes no sense. Now, to get that resolved, HUD has to be involved. HUD has to be in court. HUD has to be, right? And I can't tell you how many times I sat in court observing, and somebody from the housing department was supposed to be there to speak to the fact that like they were the payer that had not been paying. Because that's not a legal basis for evicting then. If the non-payment is on account of the tenant, landlord can evict even if it's a voucher holder. If the non-payment is on account of the government has a legal reason. Landlord cannot evict on that basis. But you need the government to be there and say so. And the judge will not take the tenant's word for it. And if HUD doesn't show up, you get kicked out. So Ray, the man who said they want us on the street, they want us homeless, HUD didn't show up. They didn't show up when they were supposed to. And that judge said to Ray, I am so sorry. I mean, she knew it wasn't right. But I am so sorry, but the law says you have to be out of your apartment in 7 days. That's Georgia. It's just horrible. The tenants get no time. I mean, he had to figure out where to move himself and his 3 kids in 7 days. He had lived there for 13 years. He had always paid his rent. It was devastating, and it was HUD's fault. And so absolutely these administrative agencies play a huge role, usually not in a positive sense. And so there's a lot of room for administrative like reform on that front, you know?
Quick follow-up one. Have any of the opponents been large enough that there can be class action suits against them?
Yes, absolutely. And this is an approach that some legal aid agencies are working with community. Sometimes these actors work together, right? I actually have a whole different talk on that. I gave it earlier this week, because it's really interesting when they work together. And one of the ways they work together is that the community organizations have a really good sense of what the problems are. So they know who the big actors are, like, oh, Millennia, whatever. They're corporate landlords across the country. And they're horrible, and they're exploitative everywhere. And tenant organizations realize it, and they go to legal aid and they say, oh, we know you can't do political advocacy, but this landlord is bad everywhere. Now, if legal aid is funded by the Legal Services Corporation, if they get federal funding, institutions matter, okay? Policies matter. If they get federal funding, courtesy of a la Ronald Reagan, they cannot engage in class action suits, right? This is how you defang. Legal services was getting a little bit too activist for Reagan. We paying you, essentially, and you're bringing us to court. Reagan said, no. You want federal money? You don't bring us to court. It doesn't matter if you have an actual issue that is appropriate for that, right? So now we have this institutional fissure that has happened. In many places, you have legal aid, and they can get all the government funding. Legal services, they can get the government funding. And then you have smaller legal shops, right? So it might be like Community Legal Services of New York, as opposed to New York Legal Aid. New York Legal Aid is getting the federal funding. Community Legal Services is getting philanthropic funding. They can sue whoever they want. Community organizations go to legal aid, say, help us. Legal aid says, come over here and talk to our little friends, because they can do a class action. But you see all of the processes that have, and little Ray all by himself is never gonna get there. You need these actors to be integrated and connected to each other to figure out how to get from Ray and the 500,000 other people like him to a class action lawsuit against Millennia Corporation. So they can stop stealing people's deposits all of the time, you know? So it takes Herculean efforts to hold a corporate landlord accountable in even the smallest ways. And it's not by accident. It's because we designed the system to work that way. Great question. Hey, Izzy. I was going to say Lizzie, but I stopped myself. Izzy.
So I had a question, not really related to the previous question, but one of the stories that you told about, I forget exactly what it was, but the person mentioned how when they entered the courtroom and they immediately asked what are you?
Sora. That was Sora. Not her real name, but it starts with an S. Yeah.
I was just wondering if, like, in terms of how a lot of like applications and anything else can be like applied for or sign up for, you have to do the check after the check. Do you think that it has to do with like the sort of huge freedom in relation to your risk?
That's really interesting. I think this is a tricky one, right? Because on the one hand, like we want to know what the kind of racial demographics of people who like have civil legal problems or receiving civil legal aid. We need to know that in order to like sort out the inequalities, you know? So that kind of administrative information can be used for good to identify problems, to direct resources towards communities that need them. And it's not the sort of thing that like a judge would see for the most part. The sorts of forms where you're filling that out aren't the kinds of forms that are going to go to a judge who's adjudicating your case, right? So I think that like racial information can operate in all sorts of ways in these systems. On the one hand, it can be like a mechanism, a tool for figuring out what's going on and where problems might be and trying to advance equity. And on the one hand, judges get information about people who are sitting in front of them in their courtroom, and they use that as a heuristic to decide things like who's deserving, who should have voice, who, you know. I mean, I sat in courtrooms where judges would say things that to me were so like clearly racist, but they didn't think so at all, you know. Like I was in one courtroom and there was a man who was being evicted, a black man. And many judges, the lawyers get airtime and the tenants get nothing. I mean, judges will say, you, be quiet. Don't talk in here, you know? And the judges say, this isn't your little hood where you can be loud and play loud music. Like, this is a courtroom. This is a professional space. Don't talk. I mean, to me, it's like, that is, to say that to a black man, it's not your little hood where you can be loud. Let's just string together all the stereotypes we can think of and then throw all the stereotypes at the wall and see what sticks, you know? But that judge is perfectly within his rights. And I'm quite sure people have said, why don't you interview judges? And I'm like, dear Lord, am I not interviewing enough different kinds of people? Why don't you interview landlords? What do you people want from me? Anyway, those would be interesting interviews, but I cannot. But I'm sure if I were to talk to a judge, they would not at all think that, I mean, no, I'm not racist. I don't see color. But, you know, this isn't your little hood where you can be loud. And so race can operate in really different ways, and information about race can operate in really different ways. So that's a great question.
I have done a terrible job keeping time.
Oh, so have I. I have no idea I don't even know what time we're supposed to stop. Let's just stay all night. No,
Yeah.
let's not.
Why don't I collect the two hands together quickly for final questions? So you here and then back there.
I have a quick question about, you know, where people who've been unhoused for longer periods of time kind of fit into this
Yes.
bigger picture about housing injustice.
Yes.
And if you spoke to any people who have been unhoused for like multiple years or something like that.
Yes, that's a great question. I'll get to it. Let's take the second one so I can bundle them, right?
Is there a hand in the back corner as well? Okay, I'm seeing things that don't exist. Why don't we just take this one?
Awesome. Yeah, you know, the unhoused population, especially like chronically or long-term unhoused, is really challenging. And I honestly came into this project not really thinking about those folks. And then I came across some community organizations that, again, remember what the interviews give you, like what you don't know, you don't know. And I came into here it just wasn't on the radar. It's on your radar, clearly, and I'm curious about why, but we don't have all night. But I bet there's a reason why. Some kind of pre-existing interest you have or experience or something like that, right? But it wasn't on my radar. And then I started talking to community organizations that would say, yeah, we are one of our target populations that we really want to try to get more involved in our mobilization efforts are the unhoused. And the challenge with the unhoused is like multitude. Like one, they're not in court. They don't have any place to be evicted from, right? And so their contact with the nodes of the civil legal institutions is like much more limited. Those folks actually tend to engage the criminal side of the system more because houselessness is criminalized, right? But community organizations, because they're not legal organizations, they only use the legal problems as a catalyst. The legal problems are not the central thing they're interested in. So if they're an organization who's centrally interested in housing, then they both want to get the folks with legal problems that they're mobilizing in courtrooms and through legal aid, but they also want the unhoused because they realize these folks are essentially being harmed by a similar system, right? Like if an organization is like, the problem is that housing is a commodity. The big political goal is decommodification or social housing. You don't get that with just the tenants who are being evicted. You don't get it with just the houseless people, the unhoused people. You get it by like bringing those people together in coalition. And so some organizations, and these are not many, but some are thinking in those terms and working in a kind of coalitional way. And that's where I've seen unhoused folks become a part of the picture. Because in the formal sense, they're often quite excluded.
Could you give quick advice to students before we let you go? This is super.
Oh, advice to students. Well, first of all, keep being wonderful. I mean, every conversation I've had with you all today has just been like dynamite. And actually, if I were teaching this semester, I would go back to my Cornell students and be like, y'all gotta step up your game because Dartmouth is over here putting you to shame. But I guess main advice I would say, because I told somebody this earlier today, maybe it was you, Anthony, that I was telling this earlier today, was like identify what you really are passionate about and go after it. You don't have to have a plan. It's not like I was like, when I grow up, I want to be a professor. No way. I didn't even know this was a job. I'm like a first gen, like my parents are immigrants, low income. If somebody told me I could get paid to do what I do not, read stuff I want to read, study stuff I want to study, teach classes I want to teach, do things like that, which are like, I'm a dork, but this is really fun to me. And then like get paid better than anyone in my family has ever been paid for it, you know? That's wild, you know? And I didn't know that this was where I was going. I stumbled my way to a path by following what I really cared about. So maybe you don't know what you really deeply care about, like what you want to see different in the world and be a part of changing. If you don't know, like, give yourself space to explore. Don't just be like, but I have to be pre-med, I have to be pre-law, follow the steps. Like, give yourself a little space to, like, just explore and figure out and experiment. And if you do know, go for it. It doesn't have to fit into a preordained mold or a plan and your parents love you, but, like, it doesn't even have to be what they think, right? Explore so you can follow your passions because, you know, our world is facing some really big, hard problems. Like, we need y'all. And we need you to be thinking about how to be a force for change. And the choices that you're making now, the things you're figuring out now about yourselves, about the world, are going to position you to do that. So go do it, because my kids are younger than you, and I'm going to need you to, like, you know, keep the planet around for longer, start solving some inequalities, and make this a better world for my kids, and for those of you that will have them one day for your children. So go forth, onward.
Please join me in thanking Jamila Michener.
Thank you. That was fun. Oh, mic's still on. Good thing I didn't say I hated that.